In the summer dawn of June 22, 1941, Europe entered a new and darker chapter of its history. Before the sun rose over the plains of Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic, more than 3 million German and Axis soldiers crossed a frontier stretching nearly 2,000 kilometers, unleashing the largest military invasion the world had ever seen. Operation Barbarossa was not merely a campaign, it was the embodiment of Adolf Hitler's ideological vision, a war of annihilation meant to reshape the continent, destroy the Soviet Union, and secure the resources he believed would guarantee German dominance for generations. What unfolded in those first hours was a shock of unimaginable scale. Thousands of artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The sky filled with the engines of the Luftwaffe as wave after wave of aircraft struck Soviet airfields, catching hundreds of planes on the ground. Columns of tanks pushed through the morning mist, their tracks carving a path toward Minsk, Kiev, and Leningrad. It was blitzkrieg at a scale no commander had ever attempted, a strike designed to break a nation in a single season. But behind the precision and brutality of the opening blow lay a fatal assumption, that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly. That its armies would disintegrate. That its people would surrender. That its industrial might would fail before it had the chance to fight back. Within weeks, that illusion began to fracture. Within months, it would shatter completely. Operation Barbarossa did not simply begin the war in the East, it transformed the fate of the world. It set in motion a struggle that would consume tens of millions of lives, redraw borders, and determine the outcome of the Second World War. And in the snows before Moscow, the campaign that was meant to bring swift victory instead marked the beginning of Germany's defeat. The origins of Operation Barbarossa, Adolf Hitler's plan to destroy the Soviet Union in a single, decisive campaign, lie not only in the strategic calculations of the German High Command but in the ideological framework that shaped Nazi foreign policy from the very beginning. The war in the East was not simply another military operation among many, it was the central goal of Hitler's worldview, the ultimate theater in which he imagined Germany securing its so-called Lebensraum, eliminating what he perceived as ideological enemies, and reshaping the political map of Europe. The invasion launched on June 22, 1941 represented the culmination of these convictions. It was the largest military operation in human history, involving more than 4 million Axis soldiers, thousands of tanks and aircraft, and an enormous logistical machine stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Yet, for all its size, the plan relied on a single assumption, that the Soviet Union would collapse in 3 to 4 months. Understanding how Germany arrived at this moment requires examining the political and strategic developments between the fall of France in June 1940 and the spring of 1941. After the victories of 1939 to 1940, Hitler believed himself to be at the peak of his power. Poland had fallen in weeks. Denmark and Norway had collapsed. The Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg were conquered with unprecedented speed. France, long considered one of Europe's dominant military powers, was defeated in 6 weeks. And Britain, though standing firm, had been driven from the continent. Germany controlled the coastline from northern Norway to the Spanish border. From Hitler's perspective, the strategic road to the east was now open. The Soviet Union, which had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Germany in August 1939, was regarded by Hitler as the last major obstacle to German hegemony over Europe and the resources needed to sustain a long war: grain from Ukraine, oil from the Caucasus, coal and metallurgical assets from the Donbass. The period between the Franco-German armistice of June 1940 and the initiation of planning for Barbarossa in July of the same year revealed the extent to which Hitler saw the destruction of the Soviet Union not simply as a strategic necessity but an ideological imperative. He instructed the Wehrmacht High Command that the war in the East would be different from the operations conducted in the West. It would require total annihilation of Soviet forces, the dismantling of the political system, and the economic exploitation of conquered territories. Generals such as Franz Halder, who kept some of the most detailed diaries of the war, recorded Hitler's determination: the Soviet regime, he insisted, must be crushed in one swift campaign. Planning for Barbarossa began under the assumption that the Red Army, which had performed poorly during the Winter War against Finland in 1939–1940, was weak, disorganized and incapable of sustained resistance. German intelligence assessments, many of them flawed, underestimated Soviet mobilization capacity, industrial relocation potential, and political resilience. The Wehrmacht's operational planning rested on the belief that Soviet forces deployed near the western borders could be enveloped, destroyed, and prevented from mounting any meaningful defense deeper inside the country. The timetable, 3 to 4 months, was based on these assessments. The Soviet Union, Hitler claimed, was like a giant with feet of clay. By the end of July 1940, formal planning was entrusted to the Oberkommando des Heers, OKH, under Army Chief of Staff General Franz Halder. The planning directive, later formalized in Führer Directive No. 21, signed on December 18, 1940, outlined a three-pronged campaign. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, would advance through the Baltic states and toward Leningrad. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, would deliver the main blow, a massive strike through Minsk and Smolensk toward Moscow. Army Group South, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would secure Ukraine, seize Kiev, and drive toward the Dnieper and eventually the Caucasus. The plan called for rapid encirclement battles near the frontier, destroying Soviet field armies before they could withdraw eastward. Once the Red Army was annihilated west of the Dnieper and Dvina rivers, German forces would penetrate deeper to take the Soviet capital, cripple command structures, and force the regime into collapse. Hitler's political assumptions were central to these operational decisions. He believed that the Soviet Union, in his deeply flawed ideological view, was a fragile construct held together by fear, coercion and the Communist Party. He assumed that ethnic minorities would welcome the Wehrmacht as liberators, that the Ukrainian population would support Germany against Moscow, and that the Soviet administrative system would implode under military pressure. These assumptions were not merely miscalculations, they were the foundations upon which the entire operation rested. Germany's preparations for Barbarossa unfolded on a scale that dwarfed all previous operations. Between late 1940 and early 1941, production of military equipment increased dramatically. The Panzerwaffe, which had proven decisive in France, was expanded and reorganized. Panzer divisions were re-equipped, infantry divisions motorized, and specialized units created for operations in the vast spaces of the Soviet Union. Luftwaffe units were redeployed from Western Europe to the east, including fighter wings, tactical bomber groups, Stuka dive bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. Logistical units, railway engineers, signals regiments, and supply columns stretched for hundreds of kilometers along newly constructed assembly positions in East Prussia, occupied Poland, and along the Romanian border. One of the most significant elements of the preparation was the concentration of more than 3 million German and Axis soldiers along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. When combined with Finnish, Romanian, Hungarian and other Allied forces, the total number of troops committed to the invasion exceeded 4 million. Germany amassed over 3,000 tanks, Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, and captured Czech models, over 7,000 artillery pieces, and around 5,000 aircraft. It was the largest force ever assembled for a single offensive. Yet its very scale presented enormous logistical challenges. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, food and medical supplies had to be transported across inadequate rail networks and poor roads. German planners believed that rapid victories would compensate for these limitations. While the Wehrmacht prepared, the Soviet Union was simultaneously engaged in its own strategic moves. After occupying the Baltic states and annexing Bessarabia and northern Bukovina in 1940, the Red Army expanded its presence along the western borders. However, Soviet leadership remained deeply uncertain about German intentions. Stalin, who mistrusted Western intelligence and believed Hitler would not risk a two-front war, dismissed multiple warnings from diplomats, spies and military officers. Reports from Richard Sorge in Tokyo, from British intelligence, and even from German sources within the Soviet Union, all pointing to imminent invasion, were either minimized or ignored. Stalin insisted that Germany, bogged down in a war with Britain, would not initiate a campaign that risked overextension. This misjudgment would cost the Soviet Union millions of lives in the first months of the conflict. By early June 1941, German forces had completed their assembly. Final reconnaissance flights were conducted, disguised as training missions. Luftwaffe officers analyzed Soviet airfields, noting the regularity of aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip, a vulnerability the Germans intended to exploit in the opening hours of the attack. Meanwhile, the German logistical system reached breaking point, with tens of thousands of vehicles crowding the roads of Poland and East Prussia. Officers noted that the slightest delay or change in orders could cause immense congestion. But Hitler ignored these concerns. The timetable was fixed. The attack would begin on June 22. In the early hours of that day, the largest invasion force in history crossed the Soviet frontier. At 3:15 local time, German artillery opened fire along a front of nearly 2,000 kilometers. Luftwaffe aircraft, more than 1,200 in the first wave, struck Soviet airfields, destroying hundreds of aircraft on the ground. Bombers targeted communications hubs, rail junctions, bridges and troop concentrations. The speed and scale of the attack overwhelmed Soviet command structures. Many Soviet officers, forbidden by pre-war directives from responding to provocations without explicit orders, did not immediately authorize counterfire. As the German attack unfolded, it exposed the extent of Soviet unpreparedness, incomplete fortifications, lack of ammunition at border posts, and units deployed in forward positions without proper defensive depth. The first major successes of Barbarossa occurred in the sectors of Army Group Center. German Panzer Groups 2 and 3, commanded by Heinz Guderian and Hermann Hoth, advanced rapidly, breaking through Soviet lines near Brest-Litovsk and Białystok. Within days, German armored units had penetrated deep into Soviet territory, encircling large formations of the Red Army. By the end of June, the Białystok-Minsk pocket collapsed, resulting in the capture of more than 300,000 Soviet soldiers. Soviet attempts to counterattack were hampered by disorganization, lack of air support, and poor communication between units. Entire divisions were destroyed or scattered. Halder wrote in his diary on July 3 that the campaign was progressing with astonishing rapidity, and that the Soviet Union would be defeated within weeks. Army Group North advanced through the Baltic states with similar speed. German forces captured Kaunas, Riga and Daugavpils, pushing toward the Luga River line, the final defensive barrier before Leningrad. Luftwaffe units supported the advance by attacking rail centers, destroying convoys, and disrupting Soviet attempts to withdraw supplies. Soviet commanders, facing overwhelming pressure, attempted to form new defensive lines, but lacked the reserves to hold them. The retreat often devolved into chaos, with units breaking apart under German attack. Nevertheless, Soviet forces around Leningrad demonstrated growing resilience, preparing for what would become one of the longest and most destructive sieges in history. Army Group South confronted the most complex operational environment. The terrain of western Ukraine, with its dense river network, marshes and limited roads, slowed the movement of German forces. The Soviet Southwestern Front, one of the strongest Soviet formations at the start of the war, fought with determination. Counterattacks near Lutsk, Dubno and Brody in late June constituted one of the largest tank battles of the early war, involving more than 3,000 armored vehicles. Although the Red Army suffered heavy losses, these engagements disrupted German timetables and revealed that Soviet strength was far greater than intelligence had predicted. German officers noted the ferocity of Soviet resistance, but still believed victory was inevitable. By early July, however, cracks in the German plan began to appear. While the Wehrmacht achieved unprecedented territorial gains, its logistical systems were under immense strain. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers across poor roads. Vehicles broke down in large numbers, maintenance crews could not keep pace. Ammunition and fuel shortages became frequent. The further German units advanced, the more difficult it became to support them. Yet Hitler and the High Command pressed forward, convinced that the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse. In the central sector, after the destruction of the Białystok-Minsk pocket, Army Group Center pushed toward Smolensk. Soviet forces, though battered, regrouped and formed new defensive positions along the Dnieper and Dwina rivers. The battle for Smolensk, lasting from mid-July to early August, was one of the key engagements of the early campaign. German armored units encircled massive Soviet formations near Smolensk, Roslavel and Yertsevo, capturing or destroying hundreds of thousands of soldiers. But the cost was high. Soviet counterattacks, conducted by newly formed armies, slowed the German advance and forced the Wehrmacht into prolonged fighting. These delays disrupted the German timetable for the advance on Moscow. Meanwhile, Hitler intervened directly in operational planning. On July 19, he issued orders redirecting Panzer Group II, Guderian, southward toward Kiev, believing that the destruction of Soviet forces in Ukraine was essential to securing resources and preventing a Soviet buildup on the southern flank. Halder, von Bock, and most of the OKH opposed this decision, arguing that Moscow was the decisive objective. But Hitler overruled them. This diversion altered the strategic trajectory of the campaign and contributed to the failure of the German advance on Moscow later in the year. As July turned to August, the scale of Soviet losses was staggering. German reports claimed that more than 1 million Soviet soldiers had been killed, wounded or captured in the first 6 weeks of fighting. Thousands of tanks and aircraft were destroyed. Yet, contrary to German expectations, Soviet resistance stiffened. New armies were raised, reserves mobilized, and industry relocated eastward beyond the Urals. Soviet propaganda emphasized patriotic defense, and Stalin, now fully aware of the existential nature of the conflict, appealed to the population for total resistance. The Soviet state, which Hitler assumed would disintegrate under pressure, instead consolidated its authority. The battle for Ukraine intensified across the front of Army Group South. German forces captured Zhytomyr, Vinnytsia and Berdychev, gradually encircling Soviet troops around Uman. By early August, the Uman pocket collapsed, resulting in the capture of nearly 103,000 Soviet soldiers. The path to Kiev, however, remained heavily defended. Soviet formations conducted repeated counterattacks, forcing German units to divert resources and delaying their advance. Only with the arrival of Guderian's panzer group from the central sector in late August did the encirclement of Kiev become possible. The decision to divert these forces, though successful in achieving a major victory, cost the Germans precious time they could not recover. In the north, German forces reached the outskirts of Leningrad by late August. The Soviet leadership, aware of the critical importance of the city, both politically and industrially, mobilized all possible resources to defend it. Civilians were conscripted to dig trenches and build fortifications. Soviet armies from other fronts were redeployed to strengthen the defense. Although German units attempted to break through, Soviet resistance and complicated terrain slowed the advance. Hitler eventually decided that Leningrad would be encircled rather than stormed, beginning a siege that would last nearly 900 days and cost the lives of over 1 million civilians. In the center, after the brutal fighting around Smolensk, Army Group Center prepared for the final push toward Moscow. But Hitler's diversion of armored units to the south severely weakened their striking power. Supply shortages, exhausted units and growing Soviet resistance slowed the momentum of the advance. Nevertheless, plans were made for a renewed offensive, Operation Typhoon, aimed at capturing the Soviet capital before the onset of winter. The success of this operation, German planners believed, would bring the Soviet Union to its knees. The summer of 1941 marked the phase of Operation Barbarossa in which the initial shock of the German invasion began to give way to a titanic struggle that stretched across thousands of kilometers of Soviet territory. While the Wehrmacht's opening blows had destroyed dozens of Soviet divisions, captured vast swaths of land, and created the impression of an unstoppable advance, the structural weaknesses of the German plan began to make themselves visible. Barbarossa was founded on the assumption that victory would come quickly, the entire logistical, operational and political framework of the invasion was built on the idea of a short war. As the front expanded, as the distances grew greater, and as Soviet resistance became more determined, the overextension of German forces and the rigidity of Hitler's strategic thinking created frictions that no amount of battlefield brilliance could fully overcome. One of the most critical developments of August and September 1941 was the intensification of the struggle on all three operational axes, the north toward Leningrad, the center toward Moscow, and the south toward Kiev and the industrial and agricultural heartlands of Ukraine. Each direction presented distinct challenges. Each demanded resources and attention that Germany, despite its seemingly limitless early victories, could not provide simultaneously. Hitler's decision-making, increasingly influenced not by military logic but by ideological priorities and personal intuition, played a decisive role in shaping the campaign's trajectory. In the northern sector, Army Group North had advanced rapidly through the Baltic states by late August. The Soviet collapse in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania was swift, but unlike the early encirclement battles in Belarus, the Red Army units retreating toward Leningrad did not dissolve entirely. Soviet command structures reorganized, and additional armies were formed to defend the approaches to the city. The geography of the region, with lakes, rivers, marshes and limited road networks, complicated the German advance. Soviet forces, recognizing the symbolic and strategic importance of Leningrad, fought fiercely along the Luga line. Civilians joined soldiers in constructing vast defensive networks. Though German units broke through this line in late August, their momentum slowed considerably. By September, German and Finnish forces had effectively encircled the city from the south and north, but they lacked the resources to storm it. Hitler issued explicit orders: Leningrad was not to be taken by direct assault but starved into submission. This began the siege, one of the most devastating episodes of the 20th century, but also removed Army Group North from the possibility of contributing to the decisive thrust toward Moscow. Further south, Army Group Center remained the focal point of German strategic planning, though its operational strength had been diminished by the diversion of Panzer Group II under Guderian to the Ukrainian front. After the fall of Smolensk, German forces attempted to reorganize for the drive toward Moscow. However, Soviet counterattacks, launched by the newly formed reserve front armies under Timoshenko and Zhukov, delayed German preparations and inflicted significant losses. These counteroffensives, though often costly and tactically unsuccessful, achieved their strategic purpose. They bought time for the Soviet High Command to strengthen the defenses around Moscow. For the first time since the invasion began, the Wehrmacht experienced prolonged fighting that eroded both its manpower and its confidence in quick victory. The German High Command believed that the Soviet Union was close to collapse during the Smolensk battles. Soviet losses were catastrophic: hundreds of thousands of soldiers captured, immense quantities of equipment destroyed, and large territories lost. But the Soviet capacity to raise new divisions, often poorly trained, inadequately equipped, and hastily assembled, exceeded German expectations. Soviet industry, under immense pressure, was being relocated eastward. Thousands of factories were dismantled and transported to the Urals, Siberia and Central Asia. Soviet leadership mobilized reserve manpower on a scale unmatched by any other combatant in the war. Though these newly raised armies could not fight with the skill or coordination of their German counterparts, they could, and did, slow the German advance. It was in Ukraine, however, that one of the most decisive and consequential episodes of the early campaign unfolded. Army Group South, supported by Romanian, Hungarian and Slovak divisions, advanced deeper into the Ukrainian USSR throughout July and August. German units captured major cities such as Zhytomyr, Vinnytsia, and eventually Poltava. Yet the Soviet Southwestern Front, commanded initially by Mikhail Kirponos, proved far more resilient than German planners had assumed. Unlike the Western Front in Belarus, which had collapsed almost immediately, the Southwestern Front conducted coordinated counterattacks and managed orderly retreats that prevented the kind of early encirclement seen in the Białystok, Minsk and Smolensk battles. The tank battles near Lutsk, Brody and Dubno in late June, though ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated that Soviet armored capacity was not as negligible as German intelligence believed. These engagements foreshadowed the type of large-scale, attritional warfare that would later define the Eastern Front. Hitler's decision to divert Panzer Group II southward from the central sector in late July was one of the most significant strategic shifts of Barbarossa. Hitler believed that the destruction of Soviet forces in Ukraine and the capture of the region's economic resources were essential prerequisites for the fall of the Soviet Union. He also feared that the Soviet forces south of the Pripyat marshes could threaten the southern flank of Army Group Center if left intact. This decision, however, meant postponing the drive on Moscow just as the German forces reached a point where momentum was crucial. The debate between the Wehrmacht High Command (OKH) and Hitler reached a peak during this period. Halder and most of the operational leadership argued that Moscow was the decisive political, logistical and psychological objective. Hitler disagreed, insisting that the destruction of Soviet armies was more important than taking the city. The consequences of this decision were dramatic. While Army Group Center temporarily halted preparations for the advance on Moscow, Guderian's armored spearheads drove southward toward the Dnieper, linking up with Army Group South's units advancing from the west. This movement created the conditions for one of the largest encirclement battles of the war, the Battle of Kiev. As the German pincers closed around the Soviet southwestern front, Soviet commanders realized only at the last moment that they were facing encirclement on a massive scale. Stalin, believing Kiev must be defended at all costs, initially forbade withdrawal. The result was catastrophic. By late September, the Kiev encirclement was complete. More than 450,000 Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner, along with vast quantities of equipment. German forces reported capturing nearly 900 tanks and 3,500 artillery pieces. It was the largest encirclement in military history, and it inflicted immense losses on the Red Army. The fall of Kiev, though hailed in Germany as a triumph equal to the fall of France, came at a cost that was not immediately apparent. The diversion of armored forces to Ukraine had delayed the advance on Moscow by more than 6 weeks. The Wehrmacht had expended fuel, ammunition and manpower it could not easily replace. The weather, a factor often underestimated in German planning, was beginning to change. As September turned to October, heavy rains transformed roads into deep mud, slowing German movements to a crawl. While the Kiev victory removed a major Soviet force from the battlefield, it did not break the Soviet Union's will or capacity to resist. New armies were already forming east of the Dnieper. The German timetable, the core of Barbarossa, had been fatally disrupted. After Kiev, Hitler renewed his push toward Moscow. Operation Typhoon, the final offensive aimed at capturing the Soviet capital before winter, began on October 2, 1941. Army Group Center, reinforced by the return of Guderian's Panzer Group II and Hoth's Panzer Group III, launched a multi-pronged attack on the Bryansk and Vyazma sectors. German armored spearheads quickly penetrated Soviet lines, encircling multiple Soviet armies west of Moscow. The Vyazma and Bryansk pockets collapsed within weeks, resulting in the capture of approximately 663,000 Soviet soldiers, another staggering loss. German officers believed that the road to Moscow was now open. Halder wrote again in his diary that Soviet resistance was nearing its end. Hitler declared that the Soviet Union had been broken. Yet the German assumption that these victories would eliminate Soviet defensive capacity was profoundly mistaken. The Soviet High Command, under Georgy Zhukov and other senior leaders, executed emergency measures to fortify the approaches to Moscow. Civilians dug trenches, built anti-tank obstacles, and constructed defensive lines on the outskirts of the city. Factories in Moscow continued producing weapons even as the German advance approached. Reserve armies were deployed from deep within the Soviet interior. One of the critical reinforcements came from Siberia, well-trained, winter-prepared divisions that the Soviet leadership could finally release after receiving intelligence that Japan would not attack the USSR in 1941. These divisions would play a decisive role in the coming months. By mid-October, German forces were within 100 kilometers of Moscow. The fall of the city seemed imminent. The Soviet government evacuated many ministries to Kuibyshev, though Stalin famously remained in Moscow. Panic gripped the population. German reconnaissance units reported seeing the spires of the Kremlin through binoculars. German propagandists prepared announcements declaring the imminent capture of the Soviet capital. But the Wehrmacht's advance slowed dramatically. Cold rains turned into snow and then melted again, creating deep mud, the infamous Rasputitsa. Trucks became mired in mud, horses struggled, tanks burned excessive fuel to make minimal progress. The logistical system, already stretched to the limit, began to collapse. German soldiers lacked adequate winter clothing, equipment and shelter. Frostbite and disease increased daily. Soviet resistance intensified as the Germans approached the Mozháysk defense line, a series of fortifications east of Vyazma. Though hastily constructed, these defenses bought precious time. Soviet infantry and artillery units, many of them newly raised, fought with determination that surprised German commanders. The closer the Wehrmacht came to Moscow, the more desperate and skilled the Soviet defense became. As October gave way to November, temperatures dropped sharply. Snowstorms disrupted German supply lines even further. Luftwaffe operations were hampered by weather and fuel shortages. The Wehrmacht's once unstoppable momentum was replaced by grinding attrition, exhaustion and logistical breakdown. By late November, the main German thrusts converged on the outskirts of Moscow. Guderian's forces advanced toward Tula, hoping to encircle the city from the south. Hoth's panzers pressed from the northwest, and von Kluge's infantry armies attempted to break through to the capital from the west. But Soviet lines held. Units of the 50th Army resisted stubbornly at Tula, preventing Guderian's breakthrough. Northwest of Moscow, Soviet forces launched localized counterattacks that slowed Hoth's advance. The closer the Germans came, the more evident it became that the Red Army was far from defeated. On November 30, German units reached the village of Krasnaya Polyana, just 30 kilometers from the Kremlin. This was the high water mark of the German advance. Soldiers could reportedly see the faint glow of Moscow's lights. But they could go no further. Fuel shortages, ammunition scarcity, freezing temperatures, and relentless Soviet resistance brought the offensive to a halt. The Wehrmacht had reached the limit of its operational capabilities. Even if another breakthrough were possible, the army lacked the strength to exploit it. Barbarossa, conceived as a lightning campaign of 3 to 4 months, had failed to achieve its objectives before winter. The Soviet Union seized the initiative. On December 5, 1941, under the command of Zhukov, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive along the entire Moscow front. Siberian divisions, equipped for winter combat and supported by artillery and tanks, struck the exhausted German lines. The Wehrmacht, unprepared for both the weather and the scale of the Soviet counterattack, was forced into retreat. Hundreds of kilometers of previously gained territory were lost. German commanders pleaded for permission to withdraw to more defensible positions. Hitler, however, issued strict orders prohibiting retreat. Units were to stand and fight where they were, regardless of circumstances. The winter of 1941 to 1942 inflicted immense suffering on both sides. German casualties mounted rapidly due to combat, frostbite and disease. Soviet forces, though better prepared for the conditions, also paid a high price. But the significance of the Soviet counteroffensive was clear. The Red Army had demonstrated the capacity not merely to defend but to launch major operations. The myth of German invincibility had been broken. Barbarossa had failed to achieve its primary objective, the destruction of the Soviet Union. The war in the East, which Hitler had envisioned as a quick campaign, had transformed into a prolonged, attritional conflict of unprecedented scale. By the end of 1941, the strategic consequences of Barbarossa's failure became evident. Germany had committed its most powerful forces to the Eastern Front and had suffered irreplaceable losses in men and material. The Soviet Union, though battered, remained in the fight. Its industrial base, relocated beyond the Urals, was beginning to produce tanks, aircraft and artillery in numbers that would soon surpass German production. The United States, though not yet formally at war with Germany until early December 1941, was supplying the Soviet Union and Britain through Lend-Lease. The global balance of power began to shift. Operation Barbarossa, the largest, most ambitious, and most ideologically driven offensive in German military history, had reached the point of irreversible failure. The initial victories had been immense, but they were not decisive. The Red Army had not collapsed. The Soviet state had not disintegrated. The Wehrmacht had not reached Moscow. A war intended to last a few months had instead opened the door to a conflict that would stretch across 4 years and consume millions of lives. The Eastern Front, born in the summer dust of 1941, would endure through the snows of 1942, the blood of Stalingrad, the armored clashes at Kursk, and the final battles in Berlin. The failure of Operation Barbarossa by the end of 1941 marked the transition from a war of rapid maneuver to one of attrition, endurance, and industrial capacity. What began on June 22 as the largest military offensive in human history, driven by ideological certainty and unprecedented operational ambition, confronted a reality that neither Hitler nor the Wehrmacht had fully understood. The Soviet Union possessed strategic depth, human reserves, industrial resources and political resilience far beyond the expectations of German planners. The defeat before Moscow was not the end of the war in the East, but it was the end of the war Germany had intended to fight. From this moment forward, the conflict transformed irreversibly into a struggle that Germany lacked the means to win. As the winter of 1941 to 1942 tightened its grip, German forces faced conditions for which they were utterly unprepared. The forward elements of Army Group Center, some of which had come within 30 kilometers of the Kremlin, now lacked proper shelter, winter clothing, or sufficient supplies. Temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Weapons malfunctioned in the cold. Lubricants froze. Trucks refused to start. Horses, the backbone of German logistics, died in thousands. Soldiers fought not only the Red Army but frostbite, starvation, exhaustion, and disease. The improvised winter clothing of German troops, scarves made of sacking, newspapers stuffed into boots, makeshift mittens, reflected the collapse of logistical planning that had assumed the war would end before winter. Soviet troops, bolstered by reinforcements from Siberia and the Far East, exploited the weakening German front. The counteroffensive launched on December 5, 1941 achieved more than any Soviet operation had done since the war began. The Red Army drove the Germans back from the outskirts of Moscow, liberated dozens of towns and villages, and forced the Wehrmacht into its first large-scale withdrawal of the war. The psychological impact was immense. German soldiers who months earlier believed themselves invincible now saw retreat as the only means of survival. Hitler, however, forbade large withdrawals and dismissed generals who suggested tactical regrouping. He issued the notorious "stand fast" orders, demanding that units hold positions at any cost. These directives inflicted staggering casualties. Entire German divisions were frozen in place, unable to maneuver or adapt. Despite these losses, the Soviet winter counteroffensive did not achieve a complete strategic breakthrough. Soviet forces suffered enormous casualties, lacked coordination among newly formed armies, and often advanced beyond their logistical limits. Nonetheless, they had accomplished what few in the world believed possible. They had pushed the Wehrmacht away from the gates of Moscow and preserved the capital. Soviet morale soared. For the first time since the invasion began, the Soviet population saw tangible proof that the German advance could be stopped. Stalin used this moment to strengthen internal control, intensify mobilization, and rally the nation around a vision of a long war of liberation. The consequences of Barbarossa's failure extended far beyond the battlefield. The German economy, still not fully mobilized for total war, began to show signs of strain. The losses of 1941 were staggering: more than 750,000 German casualties, tens of thousands of vehicles destroyed or rendered inoperable, and irreplaceable losses among experienced officers and non-commissioned officers, the backbone of the German army. The Luftwaffe, which had achieved air superiority in the opening days of the campaign, saw its strength eroded by attrition, maintenance shortages, and the harsh climate. German industry, though efficient, lacked the capacity to match Soviet mass production once the USSR's industrial base had been safely relocated beyond the Urals. The Soviet Union, by contrast, underwent one of the most remarkable industrial mobilizations in history. Factories relocated from Ukraine, Belarus and Western Russia were reassembled in the Urals, Siberia and Central Asia. Production of T-34 tanks, Katyusha rocket launchers, IL-2 ground attack aircraft, artillery pieces and small arms increased steadily throughout 1942. The Soviet state imposed strict discipline on the population, mobilizing millions into military service and war production. These measures exacted a heavy human cost, but they enabled the Soviet war effort not only to recover but to surpass German output in critical categories. International dynamics also shifted dramatically. The United States, already supplying Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, entered the war against Germany following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor and Hitler's subsequent declaration of war on the United States in December 1941. This decision, taken without consultation with the German High Command, fundamentally altered the global balance of power. Germany now faced the combined industrial might of the United States, the Soviet Union and the British Empire. The strategic implications were enormous. Even if Germany had achieved a stalemate in the East, it could not match the long-term production capacities of its enemies. Barbarossa's failure ensured that Germany would eventually be overwhelmed by the sheer weight of Allied resources. In early 1942, the Eastern Front assumed a shape that would define the conflict for the next 3 years. The front line stretched more than 2,000 kilometers, from the Leningrad region in the north to the Black Sea in the south. Both sides prepared for renewed offensives. Hitler and the German High Command recognized that a renewed push toward Moscow was no longer feasible. The Wehrmacht lacked both the strength and the logistical capacity for such an operation. Instead, attention shifted southward. Hitler believed that the resources of Ukraine and the oil fields of the Caucasus were essential for sustaining the German war effort. He concluded that only by seizing these territories could Germany regain the strategic initiative. This shift in focus would lead to the 1942 summer offensive and ultimately to the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the most consequential battles of the war. But before German forces could launch new operations, they had to stabilize their lines. Throughout the winter of 1941 to 1942, both sides engaged in bitter fighting along the Eastern Front. The Soviet winter counteroffensive pushed the Germans back up to 250 kilometers in some areas. Cities such as Kaluga, Klin and Kalinin were liberated. In the north, the siege of Leningrad tightened, but Soviet forces attempted repeated efforts to break or at least alleviate the encirclement. In the south, German and Romanian forces struggled to hold defensive positions along the Meuse and Donets rivers. The fighting was often chaotic, with both armies exhausted and battered. Yet the Germans managed to prevent a complete collapse of the front. Hitler attributed this to his "stand fast" orders, claiming that retreat would have led to disaster. Many historians, however, argue that rigidly forbidding tactical withdrawal cost the Wehrmacht an opportunity to restore more coherent defensive lines earlier in the winter. Despite enormous losses, German forces retained substantial combat capability. The Wehrmacht remained the most experienced and tactically sophisticated army in the world, with effective junior leadership, efficient staff systems and cohesive combat units. German doctrine emphasized combined arms operations and flexibility at the operational level. These strengths enabled the Germans to regroup in early 1942. Reinforcements arrived, divisions were refitted, and defensive positions improved. Nevertheless, the German army of early 1942 was fundamentally different from the army that had crossed the Soviet frontier in June 1941. The Wehrmacht had lost much of its offensive edge. Tens of thousands of veterans were gone. The logistics system was degraded. The army was now stretched across a front too vast to be supplied adequately. For the Soviet Union, winter 1941 to 1942 was both a triumph and a period of profound vulnerability. The achievement of defending Moscow came at immense cost. Millions of soldiers had been killed or wounded. Entire armies had been destroyed earlier in the year. Despite industrial mobilization, shortages remained severe. But the morale of the Soviet population and military leadership had been transformed. The Soviet Union had survived the most powerful attack ever launched. The myth of Blitzkrieg's invincibility had been shattered. The Red Army leadership, reorganized and strengthened by Stalin's appointment of Zhukov, Vasilevsky and other competent commanders, prepared for the next stage of the war with a deeper understanding of German tactics and their own capabilities. The winter battles exposed a critical flaw in the German war effort: the reliance on short-term operational success rather than long-term strategic planning. Barbarossa had been conceived as a campaign that would eliminate the Soviet Union in a matter of months. No provisions had been made for winter warfare, long-term occupation, or sustained attrition. German forces had not prepared winter equipment, adequate supply chains or reserves of manpower. This failure reflected Hitler's ideology-driven assumptions about the Soviet Union. The belief that the USSR would collapse quickly shaped every aspect of planning, from logistics to intelligence to operational design. When the Soviet Union did not collapse, Germany found itself in a war it was not prepared to fight. Another consequence of Barbarossa's failure was the intensification of the occupation regime across the territories captured by Germany. Nazi policies in the East were governed by ideological imperatives: the destruction of Jews, the exploitation of local populations, and the expropriation of resources. The economic exploitation plan known as the Hunger Plan resulted in mass starvation among civilians in occupied areas, particularly in Ukraine, Belarus and Russia. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units, carried out systematic mass murder behind the front lines. These policies had multiple effects: they inflicted catastrophic suffering, they fueled resistance movements, and they undermined Germany's ability to consolidate control over occupied territories. Many communities that might have initially greeted the Germans with caution or even hope quickly realized that Nazi occupation offered no liberation. As spring approached in 1942, both Germany and the Soviet Union assessed the strategic situation. For Hitler, the failure to take Moscow did not alter his belief that the Soviet Union could still be defeated. He interpreted Soviet resilience as a temporary obstacle, one that could be overcome with a decisive campaign in the south. Hitler fixated on Ukraine's agricultural wealth and the Caucasus oil fields, which he saw as critical to the German war effort. The German petroleum situation was increasingly dire. Without access to the Caucasus oil, Germany would face crippling shortages. The decision to shift the focus of operations from Moscow to the south was thus driven not only by ideology but by material necessity. The Soviet leadership, meanwhile, understood that the German threat remained enormous. Despite the success of the winter counteroffensive, Soviet losses had been so heavy that offensive operations in early 1942 were risky. Nonetheless, Stalin, seeking to maintain momentum and convinced that the Red Army could exploit German disarray, ordered a series of offensives across the front. These operations, including the Rzev, Vyazma offensives and the ill-fated Kharkiv offensive in May 1942, resulted in heavy Soviet losses. At Kharkiv, German forces encircled and destroyed significant Soviet units, capturing more than 200,000 soldiers. These defeats exposed weaknesses in Soviet coordination and highlighted the limits of offensive action before the Red Army had fully recovered its strength. While these battles raged, the strategic consequences of Barbarossa's failure continued to unfold across Europe and the world. Germany's inability to defeat the Soviet Union quickly encouraged resistance movements in occupied territories. Partisan warfare expanded in Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, tying down German forces and complicating lines of communication. In the Balkans, Yugoslav and Greek resistance movements gained momentum. In North Africa, the British 8th Army and German Afrika Korps fought for control of Egypt and the Suez Canal, drawing resources and attention away from the Eastern Front. Japan's entry into the war and the expansion of conflict across the Pacific further stretched Axis capabilities. By mid-1942, Germany prepared for its next major offensive, Operation Blue, Fall Blau. This campaign, aimed at seizing the Caucasus oil fields and destroying Soviet forces in southern Russia, represented Hitler's attempt to regain the initiative after the failure before Moscow. The capture of these resources, he believed, would enable Germany to sustain the war beyond 1942. But Operation Blue, though initially successful, ultimately led to one of the most catastrophic defeats in German military history, the Battle of Stalingrad. The city, located on the Volga River, became the focal point of a brutal, months-long battle that consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. The failure at Stalingrad marked the definitive turning point of the war in the East and sealed the ultimate fate of the German war effort. Operation Barbarossa, therefore, must be understood not only as a failed offensive but as the moment that determined the entire trajectory of World War II. Its consequences shaped the remainder of the conflict: the massive escalation of industrial warfare, the expansion of the Allied coalition, the emergence of the Soviet Union as a global military power, and the eventual destruction of Nazi Germany. The invasion of the Soviet Union unleashed a war of annihilation, unprecedented in its scale and cruelty, that resulted in the deaths of tens of millions of soldiers and civilians. The Eastern Front became the largest and bloodiest theater of the Second World War. In retrospect, the failure of Barbarossa was inevitable given the assumptions upon which it was built. German intelligence underestimated Soviet strength. Logistics were insufficient for a campaign of such scale. Ideological goals distorted strategic planning. The belief in a quick victory blinded the German leadership to the realities of the Eastern theater. Once the initial shock of Blitzkrieg dissipated, the Soviet Union could draw upon its vast manpower, industrial capacity, and strategic depth. The German army, for all its tactical brilliance and operational skill, could not overcome these structural advantages in a long war. By the time the winter of 1941 to 1942 ended, the Eastern Front had settled into a pattern that would last until 1945, a war of attrition, fought across continents, involving vast armies and immense material resources. Operation Barbarossa, conceived as the decisive blow to end the war, instead inaugurated a struggle that would destroy the Third Reich. The Wehrmacht's initial triumphs, impressive as they were, proved insufficient against an enemy capable of absorbing unimaginable losses, mobilizing resources beyond German reach, and fighting with a determination born of national survival. The legacy of Barbarossa is one of immense tragedy and sacrifice. Millions of soldiers and civilians perished in the opening months alone. Entire cities were devastated. Communities were torn apart. Families were destroyed. The brutality of the occupation, the systematic extermination policies, and the sheer scale of suffering make Barbarossa one of the darkest chapters in human history. Yet within this tragedy emerged acts of extraordinary endurance, bravery, and resilience. The Soviet people, confronted with annihilation, fought with a tenacity that altered the course of world history. By late 1942, as Soviet forces prepared to encircle the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, it became undeniable that Barbarossa had not only failed but doomed the German war effort. The Eastern Campaign, envisioned as a 3-month operation, became a 4-year battle that consumed the vast majority of German military resources. The Wehrmacht, once the spearhead of Hitler's ambitions, became bogged down in a war it could not win. The Soviet Union, having survived the onslaught of 1941, now stood poised to begin the long counteroffensive that would carry its armies across Eastern Europe and ultimately into Berlin. The operation that began with the confidence of rapid conquest ended with the certainty of German defeat. Operation Barbarossa was the turning point of the Second World War. It was the moment when Hitler's ambitions exceeded the limits of German power and where ideological fanaticism overwhelmed strategic logic. It was a campaign defined by destruction, sacrifice and endurance, a struggle whose consequences shaped the modern world and whose memory endures as a testament to the profound cost of war.